A Crane's Critique is the fourth episode of the fourth season of Frasier. This is directed by Jeff Melman, and as always, there will be spoilers from now as I talk about what happens in this episode. And it starts off outside Cafe Nervosa. Niles is talking excessively about the foam on the top of the coffee. Martin is clearly not impressed by this. They've actually taken him out to go clothes shopping. Roz then comes down and she analyses a man on a nearby table, and then Frasier and Niles spot somebody a little bit in the distance, off camera, we can't see them, and it turns out that this is, they believe, T.H. Houghton, who wrote a book called Time Flies Tomorrow that they read in high school. Even Roz read it in high school. Apparently seems like a really popular book. They are very big fans. So they decide to try and chase after him, and they go into a bar because Niles thinks he went in there, and they don't see him, so they leave. Martin, completely not having any of this, decides to just stay in the bar, and he starts talking to somebody, and this somebody is played by Robert Prosky, who's been in loads of stuff. Most recently, I watched him in Veronica's Closet, which was pretty great. He played Veronica's father. This is irrelevant to the episode, and it turns out that this is actually T.H. Houghton. And Niles and Frasier come back into the bar and realise this, and they can't believe that Martin was talking to him. They then go to a gallery, and then they go back to Frasier's apartment just as Martin and T.H. Houghton are entering the lift. Apparently Houghton is only in town for a few days, so he actually looked up Martin and decided to spend some time with him, which is rather nice. And obviously Frasier and Niles are once again annoyed that they just missed Houghton. Apparently he'd been there all afternoon, and he'd even spent time with Eddie. And Frasier calls Eddie a miserable little biscuit whore, which I absolutely loved. Eddie was absolutely adorable in this episode, as he always is. We then see Daphne lounging on the sofa, and Eddie barks to alert Daphne that Frasier is approaching the building, which I love for approaching the apartment, and she very quickly begins cleaning, and it turns out that Houghton is actually coming over again because he's going to a game with Martin, and Daphne happens to mention that afterwards he's going to the publishers to drop off his new book. And Niles and Frasier are, of course, very excited about this because he's only ever written one book, and this is just incredible. And they both rest on the sofa, and I didn't see it, and I feel like such an idiot because Niles is resting his head on the back and talks about how Houghton had a satchel, and in that satchel the book manuscript was probably inside, and that satchel is now resting under his head, and it's so obvious once he points it out, but it just didn't occur to me that Niles' head was resting on a satchel until he pointed it out, which I thought was rather amusing, but it made me feel rather silly. And I loved Daphne in this moment because she sees them handling the manuscript and she gets very annoyed at them because they have no right to do this, but she turns it to her advantage by saying that if she had the day off, she wouldn't be around to get annoyed by this and tell Houghton. And what's the point in having a day off if you have no money to do things? And she ends up getting the day off and some money, which is pretty entertaining. I rather like Daphne in that moment. And they're reading the manuscript, and I actually thought, I've seen this episode before, but I couldn't remember how it played out, and I genuinely thought they'd be reading the manuscript and hate it. I thought that's the direction they were going in, but actually it wasn't. They really enjoyed it, and unfortunately Martin and Houghton catch them reading it. And he asks them for feedback, and they praise it, and he ends up calling his own manuscript crap, because he realises in that moment he lifted the structure from Dante, and he establishes that he must just have nothing original left to say, and he doesn't want to submit this to the publisher anymore, so he tries to burn it, and then he just throws it off of the balcony. And I do feel like we had a missed opportunity for some comedy with Niles and Frasier running out to try and capture the manuscript and gather up the paper. I think that could have been an interesting direction to take things, but that's not where they went. What they decided to do was have a moment with Frasier and Niles where they managed to convince themselves that they did the right thing. Because if Houghton had submitted the manuscript, if it had been published, the reviewers in the paper would have said the same things that they did, and that would have crushed him on a much larger scale. That's their logic. And yeah, it kind of makes sense, but also it doesn't excuse what they did. But it's a good episode. I really enjoyed it. As a writer, I could definitely feel a lot of things that Houghton was saying. As a reader, I could definitely connect with Frasier and Niles in this desperation for a book by a writer they really admire. And then we end with another moment with Daphne starting to clean only when Eddie alerts her that Frasier is coming in. And it's a nice way to end things. It's a really good episode, one that I really thoroughly enjoyed. We have obviously a lot of really funny moments. We have some great moments with Martin, and definitely one that I will always be happy to watch. A Crane's critique is pretty decent.